Half of all Americans now die in hospice care. My husband, my father did. They were fortunate to have compassionate care. The hospice movement was conceived of in the 1970s to provide humane, compassionate care to the terminally ill in their final days, attending not only to their physical needs, but also to their social and emotional well-being. In 1981, President Reagan recognized the potential cost savings, Natch, of having patients forswear curative treatment and institutionalized hospice as a Medicare program. Then something went predictably wrong. The idea that privatization will provide more competent, efficient care is the great con, one of the great cons of our time. Easy money and a lack of regulation transformed a crusade to provide death with dignity into an industry rife with fraud, exploitation, and abuse. Ava Kofman's Endgame, which we honor tonight, is a deeply, powerfully reported expose of the hospice industry, a $22 billion juggernaut that funnels public dollars into private coffers, often for staggeringly bad care or no care at all. In significant ways, Endgame reminds me of Jessica Mitford's 1963 scathing expose, The American Way of Death. I recommend it. It was reissued in 1986, I believe. The most shocking things Ava Kofman exposed: it's more profitable to take in patients who aren't actually dying, and that hospice may actually harm patients who aren't actually dying. Ava Kofman, who, by the way, is a former Nation intern, class of 2015, a program started in 1978 by the late great Nation editor Victor Navasky, tells the story of a whistleblower who was sent by her employer, a private hospice provider, to prowl the back roads of the Black Belt of Alabama and Mississippi, looking for people whom she called, quote, uneducated, people who could be tricked into signing up for hospice, even if they weren't dying. A 29-year-old pregnant woman learned that she'd been enrolled in hospice only when she visited for her doctor for a blood test. Another unwitting recruit lost access to chemotherapy treatment after being put in hospice without his knowledge. Ava Kofman describes in riveting detail hospice providers bribing doctors to recruit patients with trips to Vegas or using outright kickbacks. One hospice owner allegedly told his staff to overdose a patient who had stayed on the service too long. Quote, "He better not make it tomorrow, or I will blame you, he texted a nurse. Whistleblowers have become the government's primary defense against hospice wrongdoing. Kofman's reporting relied on some of the whistleblowers, but it is her rigorous reporting that has had an enormous impact. Industry leaders banded together to push for greater oversight. Legislation has been introduced in various states and in Washington. And Kofman has also written a research guide for families to help them find ethical providers for their loved ones. We are very proud to present the 2023 Hillman Prize for magazine journalism to Ava Kofman.
Thank you so much, Katrina, and thank you for patiently sitting through, I think it was a pitch on asteroid mining. That was pretty interminable when I was an intern. It's such an honor to be here tonight among so many journalists and editors and activists that I admire. Thank you to my editors, Kit Rackless and Kate Boo, and to the copy editor, photographers, fact checker, who all worked with me on this investigation. Thank you to the Hillman Foundation and its judges for honoring work on a subject that no one, including doctors, really likes to think about. We're so encouraged to look away from death and dying that it often feels like it's a cultural norm. So it's been wonderful to see lawmakers now demanding that Medicare account for how and why hospice profiteering has reached these grotesque levels. As Katrina mentioned, regulators have responded to this story by releasing public data on hospice ownership, by overhauling the hospice inspection process, and by auditing some of the suspicious providers, really suspicious providers, the story highlighted. These efforts are welcome and overdue, but they're not enough. What most people don't realize until it's too late is that even at its best, hospice depends on the devotion of unpaid caregivers, unpaid family members, to do most of the work. I was surprised to learn that that's by design. Hospice was pitched to Ronald Reagan as a way to rein in federal spending on older Americans. And of course, as some of you well know, the situation is even worse if you actually have years to live. There's virtually no long-term care benefit right now in this country for the millions of people who suffer from a serious illness or disability. 1/5 of all Americans are unpaid caregivers for an older adult. But this massive political constituency lacks the labor movement or the Sidney Hillman that it deserves. By becoming what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross once called a death-denying society, we've engaged in a kind of peculiar magic trick that turns this universal fact, death, dying, illness, into somehow a matter of personal responsibility. Of course, many people want to care for their sick loved ones, and for some, it's even a privilege. But this pernicious conflation of labor and love prevents families from demanding from the state the resources they desperately need. Obviously, in a political environment in which candidates are talking about shrinking Medicare, it can feel difficult to imagine Congress investing in an expanded hospice benefit or even a long-term care entitlement. Just imagine it. But at the very least, I think we can start by acknowledging that our failures to adequately care for our loved ones when they are dying or ill are usually not failures of love, but failures of politics. Our paid hospice caregivers also deserve better. The employees I interviewed were appalled that their companies were enrolling people who weren't even actually dying. Some of the people I talked to, some of the nurses I interviewed, would go to visit a patient at their house, assuming they would be bedbound. They were allegedly a hospice patient, only to find that they were out shooting deer or tap dancing. Since we published this story, I've been hearing from many workers who were once idealistic volunteers in the hospice movement in its kind of radical heydays in the 1970s, which Katrina alluded to. And they've become so disillusioned by its commodification that they've left the field altogether. I'd like to dedicate tonight's honor to them and to the many workers who have risked their jobs over the decades, since at least 2001, blowing the whistle on abuses within this industry in the hope that it might still live up to its vital, radical mission. Thank you.